United Nations Secretary General is making a new call for an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Antonio Guterres is doing that in Moscow, just before he sits down with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
It is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as he spoke in Moscow earlier, and you heard live here on CBC News Network, alongside Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, Briar Stewart is in Riga, Latvia. She was listening in to that briefing from both of the leaders. From the UN Secretary General, Briar, what did we hear in terms of concrete proposals?
Well, Heather, he started off his statement after the working lunch that he had with Sergei Lavrov, saying that he was a messenger of peace. That was the message that the UN Secretary General had. And that was really the tone that he tried to strike throughout the press conference and then the questions that he was asked afterwards. And in terms of a concrete proposal, Guterres has talked about the need to create a humanitarian working group. So this is a group that would involve Russia, Ukraine, and the UN. And it would be focused on trying to open up humanitarian corridors, particularly around Mariupol, where we know there are as many as 1,000 civilians still trapped in that large steel plant. He talked specifically about that area, but also just the need to bring in food and supplies to so many parts of Ukraine that have been essentially surrounded by war. Now, as I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of criticism for Russia in his speech, or his address rather, in that press conference. He really tried to strike a conciliatory tone. And the UN has come under a lot of criticism as late, just for how they've basically handled the organization's response to this invasion. There was a motion that was put forward by the Security Council back in February, just a few days after Russia's troops moved into Ukraine, and it wasn't passed because, of course, Russia holds a veto on the Security Council, so it blocked the motion. So certainly Ukrainian officials have been calling for the UN to take a harder line against Russia and to find ways to curb its influence. And that's the kind of message that I think we'll hear from President Volodymyr Zelensky again when Guterres is scheduled to meet with him on Thursday.
We heard from the Secretary General very clearly as he described what he called a frank discussion with Sergei Lavrov, but he also made it clear there were two very different viewpoints on what is happening in Ukraine. So for the Russian side of things, what did Sergei Lavrov say, Briar?
Well, what we heard from Russia's foreign minister was really an echoing of what Russian officials have been saying all along, that they were forced to act, that really a lot of this blame should be placed on the West. He talked about how the West is pumping Ukraine full of weapons and that it could really lead to just an escalatory situation where this could spill over to an even larger conflict. And, you know, Lavrov was asked a number of questions from reporters. A lot of the reporters that were there, of course, were from state media. But I think it's important to mention an interview he gave to a state media journalist the other day. So not today, but it was a sit-down interview. And he talked about how the world should not underestimate the threat of nuclear war. So that's a very stark warning coming from a country like Russia that is so heavily armed with nuclear weapons. And he talked about how, because you have so many countries, NATO countries, that have given Ukraine weapons and other aid, he talked about how Russia is really involved in a proxy war right now with the West. So that's kind of an escalation of tone, I would say. I mean, I don't think we've heard the foreign minister use that term proxy war against NATO, but certainly that's the language that they're using now. And so really coming out of this UN visit today, it's not at all clear that there'll be any progress.
Briar, thank you very much. Briar Stewart from Riga, Latvia.